Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hi, welcome to Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers. My guests today for part 2 of the discussion are Chuck Logan and John Camp. Chuck has written 3 novels beginning in 1996 with Hunter's Moon and continuing through The Price of Blood and The Big Law. He was nominated for the Minnesota Book Award in 1999, and we last interviewed him here on Northern Lights in 1996. Also with me is John Camp, also known as John Sandford, who's probably best known for his Lucas Davenport Prey series, but has also written 3 novels featuring the character Kid and 1 featuring the character Ann Bathory, the book Night Crew. He was a journalist for the Pioneer Press and nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 1980 and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1986 for a feature he did entitled Life on the Land, An American Farm. He's also written a couple of nonfiction books, one on art and one on plastic surgery. Again, welcome back for the second session. I appreciate it. Let's just kind of take a different spin. We've talked a little bit about influences and how you met in the previous episode, but let's just take another kind of a personal look at the kind of things you do. What kind of hobbies do you have? Chuck, why don't we start with you? What kinds of things do you do when you're not writing and not, taking care of your young daughter?
Landscaping my large backyard, getting too old now to move rocks around. Other than sort of, just general exercise. I used to be into karate years ago, and I started getting older and decided I was too old for that, so I got into yoga and totally wrecked my back and my body in yoga. Should have stayed with karate.
I've never heard that.
Hunting, John and I hunt, in Novembers. It's kind of one of the things we do.
Great. John, you've got a raft of interests. I understand, painting and karate is also among them. What else?
I do archaeology as my main. It's almost my other life now. I'm a photographer on a archaeological dig in Israel, and so I spend 6 or 8 weeks there every summer. We'll be going again in June, working on a dig at a place called Tel Rahov. And we have a website, and we recruit people if anybody's interested in digging in Israel. And then I've always had a thing about taking lessons. I've taken lessons in everything because whenever I go any place or try to go on a trip, I always try to sign up for some kind of lessons there because I find out that that's a way to get into the place. For example, you go to the Caribbean and you take scuba lessons, which I've done. Get certified for scuba, you spend 2 weeks hanging around with people who really know the place, or take sailing lessons or whatever. So I wind up, I do have a lot of interests. Right now, I suppose photography, golf, and then I fish and hunt pretty much. I fish all summer, and Chuck and I hunt in the fall. In fact, his new book, I'm sort of, I'm waiting for it to come out because he's got a scene that's based on a really ugly moose hunt we went on up in the Boundary Waters, and there's probably more rain than the Boundary Waters has gotten in 100 years when we were up there.
I don't think we could do that now. I think we're too old to do that now.
That wasn't that long ago. But at any rate, have quite a few interests.
Now, speaking of that common hunting trip and so on, you both tend to make sort of sly references to each other in your books periodically.
He's ahead on that.
Is ahead on that?
Yeah, I should.
Can you give me a couple of examples and tell me kind of how this started?
Well, I probably started it.
You did start it.
And it's just sort of a, I mean, you know, the two killers in my third and fourth books are named after a good friend's sons.
Mhm.
His young sons, who were like in 7th or 8th grade, said, "Name a book after it," or you know, so now these two killers are named after a friend's sons. And then with Logan, because Logan was writing, you know, it's just sort of a little needling thing. I think it's just kind of I don't know where it came from. Maybe it just comes from the generation we grew up with or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have, you know, the Logan septic service and Logan.
Unmentionable logos on T-shirts. We can't mention on family television.
Right, and you know, the logo rendering service and stuff like that. And so
So after about 4 of these books, I decided to get even. So I had a
Camp Soft Cheese.
so I had this serial killer named Camp, who was interviewed in prison. Just at any rate, John said, somehow he talked me out of doing that, as if it was overwriting, you know. And then his next book, he comes out with this long passage about this creepy Undertaker Logan, you know. So he really nailed me on that one. It was like,
So you'd been writing for a while, and Chuck, you were starting to write. I'm curious as to what your individual experiences were in getting into writing. Since you had, you know, started earlier on, do you think it was easier for you to get in, and as opposed to Chuck when you were starting to break into it?
well, John's a professional writer. I mean, I was asked to do a book review for the Pioneer Press.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote this book review, and several reporters came up and said, "Who wrote that for you?" I said, "Okay, you know, this is a sign of something."
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate enough to be taken under the wing of Deborah Howell, who used to be the executive editor of the Pioneer Press, who worked with me for a couple of years, you know, because in the beginning, you know, I was writing horribly convoluted, complex, you know, unstructured nonsense. And so I spent about 4 or 5 years just thrashing through that, you know.
Now, did you, once you decided you were aiming for a book for Hunter's Moon, or I know you were working on a Vietnam novel earlier than that, did you have to chase down an agent or and go through that process? Or was
like a lot of people, you know, John was kind enough to pass it on to his agent, who passed it on to another agent at ICM in New York, and that's how I got into it.
Okay. And when you started, was it you know, sort of less harrowing to get into the whole process?
It's always harrowing.
Mm-hmm.
When Chuck was starting, Chuck sort of wrote a book that was almost like a practice book. It was not a practice book. I mean, he was very serious about it, but he wrote a book where he was learning to write. I knew how to write, but I wrote about 3 bad books before I published one. And so I wrote books that I just simply couldn't publish. So it's pretty harrowing, because what you wind up doing is you wind up spending a lot of time writing stuff that does not get published. And it takes almost a kind of insane persistence to keep doing this. I mean, you know, to keep coming back and keep trying to write when you're not selling it, because it does take a lot of time away from your family. It takes a lot of time away from other relationships and things you might be doing on the outside, because you're sitting essentially in a little room all by yourself typing. And so it's hard to get in it. But I was, like Chuck says, I really sort of considered myself a professional writer. From I mean, I wrote the first time I can remember writing successfully was in 5th grade, when I wrote a class program. I wrote the whole program essentially. And then I worked in my high school newspapers. I worked in my college newspapers. I was a reporter in the Army. I was a reporter, and so it was a different path. I mean, I was amazed when Chuck actually pulled off the writing thing, because
See, I was more like Tano. I hung out in the bars listening for information.
But the main thing is that a lot of people don't realize how hard it is to write, and Chuck was an artist, which I'd always wanted to be an artist, but like I said, I didn't have the talent for it. But then when he started to write and the stuff started coming out, it was really good right from the beginning. And I really didn't understand how exactly that happened, because because my experience is so different.
Mhm.
So it was pretty interesting.
Well, I know from my take on Hunter's Moon, I thought it was a tremendous first novel, just a tremendous first novel.
John named that, by the way.
Did you?
More, well,
Was
sort of negotiated the title
Yeah.
out, yeah.
Oh.
The last minute. What are we going to call this? What are we going to call this? You know?
Yeah. So this didn't come out from the Moose Hunt, did it? I mean, the name of the book.
No.
No.
I don't know.
Well, that was way before the Moose Hunt.
Yeah.
No. Oh, that's interesting. So where did the name come from then? That's actually an interesting question. Do you generally get to name all of the titles or the books that you're writing? Hunter's Moon, Big Law, Night Crew, etc. Or is that a publisher's thing altogether?
With me, it's publishers. I think Chuck thinks.
Yeah, I think I finally, my next novel, I finally come up with a good title, Absolute Zero. I think
Mhm.
maybe The Big Law was all right. Hunter's Moon, in all deference to John, was, everyone calls it Harvest Moon.
Well, now there's another author who's published a book called Hunter's Moon, so you're secure now.
There's about 500,
There are a lot of them, actually.
Yeah. Cause for some confusion in that regard. In talking a little bit about the that just sort of process of writing a little bit, can you give me an idea of how you each work? I mean, what's sort of your general routine per day? Do you write a certain number of hours, a certain number of pages, when the muse strikes? Chuck?
My impression, well, John works a lot steadier than I do.
Mhm.
He puts in more. Well, part of the thing, taking care of a 3, 4, and 5-year-old has cut a lot into writing the last couple of years. But I think I'm going to accrue some benefits from that down the line in subject matter. But I start with the hardest thing I've had to learn to do is learn how to tell a story that's structured so it's accessible to a reader.
Mhm.
Because I started out writing, I would always have something buried in the past we had to go back and visit, and finally I figured out that the way to tell a good story is, have the character get up in the morning, put on his pants and start walking, whatever, and you see everything happening in sequence, so you don't have to stop it and amend it with flashbacks or provide extra information. Have a story that proceeds directly in real time in front of your eyes. That was the hardest thing for me to learn how to do.
Hmm. And do you have a particular pattern that you follow in your writing?
When I'm working, I try to work every day,
Mhm.
and I try to work for a couple 3 hours. And actually, as the year goes on, my book is due on January 1st of every year, and I try to make that just like a newspaper deadline. And I start about now. Right now, I have about 20,000 words written on my next novel. There'll be a hiatus while I go to Israel and while I do a book tour. When I come back in August, I'll begin really pushing hard. I'd hope to have 30 to 35 to 40,000 words written before August, and then in August I'll start pushing really hard. But I have an office in an office building downtown, just like a newspaper office. I work on computers, and part of it, the reason I set that structure is so that I will work every day. I tell people who are trying to write novels that if you can write one newspaper column a day, one newspaper column of type, which is this much. I mean, you can actually see it. It's only about 750 words. If you can do that for 4 months, you'll have a novel. You'll have a bestseller length novel, not a little thin one, but you will have 110 or 120,000 words. Most people can't do that. It's the biggest problem I find with newspaper reporters, all of whom, just like the old legend says, have a book stuck away someplace. They cannot write 100,000 words.
Just to carry it from...
They just can't do it, even though you can say one newspaper column a day for 4 months and it will be done. They can't do it.
You have to be able to keep the whole. At some point, you have to be able to keep 150,000 words in your head at the same time, and you have to be aware of that. Part of it's discipline. I had to train myself to get up every morning and write, regardless. But I tend to really write the book in the last 6 weeks. I mean, to really smooth it and finish it and put it together. Until then, it's like backing into it. It's like a block that you're trying to. It still looks like the original hunk of stone that you're going to get the statue out of. And then, as you get more intense into it, and a lot of times you don't know the people until you get to know them, which means you have to write the entire story. And then you go back and you sort of put things together. Hopefully, that unconsciously you work on that all the time. So you're roughing it in and getting it in the right direction. So you don't. The thing I dread is to turn in a manuscript and they'll say, "Where's the book?" You know,
The statue's not here.
Yeah, right. You know, it's like,
The character comment you made is interesting because the different people have said to me over the years that we've been doing these interviews that the characters go off in completely different directions, totally unexpected to what the author was thinking that they would do. They sort of take on a life of their own. In the process of getting to know them, do you feel like each of you still retain control over the characters?
writers have to be people who are observers, you know. I mean, and I think this is always going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you write down about a character, you know, is maybe the tip of the iceberg in the information that's starting to feed into you about that character.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you know, you seem to unconsciously set up things for the person to do later that kind of organically grow out of the character. This has to be from knowing a lot of people and watching a lot of people and just observing the quirks of human behavior.
And at the beginning of a novel, at least for me, and it sounds like for Chuck, you don't necessarily know the characters that well at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've got an idea, you've thought about them a little bit, but as you start spending more and more time with them, you know, months or a year, you know them better.
Mm-hmm.
So I have told people before that it's kind of like some kind of zigzag sewing machine when you're writing this. You write forward a little bit, but then you go back and you sort of work through it again. Then you write some more forward, then you go back and you kind of write through it again. And as you build up the kind of accrete layers of personality, the characters become more and more complex. And it's something that that I have enough experience now. I've written 15 or 16 novels that I can relax about. I don't have to worry about it because I know that's going to happen. It's not that I've made a mistake. It's just that that's the way they develop.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I've made a mistake by writing a character that's too simple at the beginning. I don't have to worry about it because I know that I'm going to come back and I'm going to have another shot at it, and that I know that as I get to know the character better, it's going to develop,
Evolve a little bit
as we go through.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like that. Just keep pushing forward as opposed to constantly refining. You know, get the paragraph written down. Don't just refine the sentence over and over
Right.
again.
And when I finish a novels in November,
Mm-hmm.
or hopefully in October, November sometime, Chuck will tell you that I'm always carrying a novel around with me when we go hunting in November, deer hunting, which is the week before Thanksgiving in Wisconsin, because that's about when I'm finishing. I spend 6 weeks or so
Mm-hmm.
doing nothing but picking over the novel and rewriting little bits and pieces really intensively. I mean, I'm working 8 hours a day at that point. I can't sleep. I can't do anything. I was going to sit up in deer stand with the novel last year and read it while I'm sitting up there, because what you're doing is that, like Chuck says, is in that last 6 weeks you really pull the novel together.
Do you read each other's work in manuscript, or do you have other readers who read your stuff in
Sometimes. I
manuscript?
mean, well,
Bits and
sure.
pieces.
Bits and pieces.
My wife kind of ruthlessly kills all the macho references. She doesn't like action. She just skips all the action parts.
Mm.
She would like me to write a book about everybody sitting around a kitchen table talking about the family. You know, I say, okay, I'm working on it, you know, but...
Yeah, that'll come out in a couple of novels or something like that. How have you found that your writing has changed? Now, you've talked about how you've had to sort of learn the writing process a little bit and refining some of the things that you put in the work. But have that been kind of the main changes or growths of your writing? Has it evolved to a more smoother process, an easier process?
Less overwriting to begin. You have to learn how to eliminate big problems at the beginning, or else you're stuck with them in the middle of the thing. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're at the end of something and turning it in with big problems, you're in a lot of trouble. You know, so I think I'm just learning how to write now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I'm finally in a situation where I'm having to get into fast turnarounds. For the first time, I've just turned in a book. I'm going to start a new book next week.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I have 2 ideas for books, and so I don't know if I want to try to pop one out every year. But before, I would always stagger around looking for a new idea and try out all these crazy ideas. And the editor, people at my age would get nervous, you know. I think the more you work at it, you learn to recognize classic pitfalls
Mm-hmm.
of things that slow down a story, things that don't work. You know, a first chapter that sounds tinny to the ear. You know.
Yeah. Let me spin on that. I'll get back to you on that question. But we were talking a little bit about the whole notion of things that slow down stories a little bit earlier, and among them, the increased character development can slow down rather a thriller to some extent. It's not as action based, but we were talking about sort of social issues, also slowing down a novel. So are those the kinds of things that you have to look at and say, am I doing too much of this or too little of that, or should I do that at all?
I think it depends who you are, what stage you are in your writing career. If you're John Grisham, you can write a novel about anything, right? Okay.
I would say, yeah.
If you have, I don't think it's the issue. I think it's the approach. There are a lot of people that have very important things they want to say,
Mm-hmm.
but the way they say it, you know, it's them telling you something, and most people don't want to hear it that way. I mean, there are ways to raise any issue and make them interesting to people. You know, some are better than others.
Right.
You know, I think it's all the way it's put into play. Some issues naturally are uncomfortable. You know, like if I wanted to write, at one point I wanted to explore the entire question of abortion as a moral fault line in America, and they went, you know.
Yeah,
I'm real interested in the whole Columbine situation in the sense of changing police culture. You know, this whole risk of, you know, like this whole notion in police forces and in the military now of risk aversion, force protection. Don't take chances.
Mm-hmm.
Pull back, call, you know, somebody for help while who knows what's going on, you know, but that's a touchy subject. I don't know if I get to do that. You know.
Yeah. And how about you? Out of the course of the 14, 15, 16 novels that you've written, I can't remember the final number.
Neither can I.
Have you found that you know, your approach to writing has changed significantly? Do you still look at a lot of those same hard issues? You know, 12 books in, as you might have the number 2 in.
Actually, the only thing that's changed is I know that it's going to end now. That I'm not worried about finishing a book. That I'm not. I'm more relaxed about that. But basically, I think you almost have to learn how to do it all over again. At least I do. But I mean, I seem to find myself making the same mistakes, having the same problems, fighting it through. The only difference now is that I sort of know how to deal with the problems when they come up.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, for example, I always think that the first chapter ought to be, in a thriller, ought to be pretty stripped down, and you don't worry too much about context or anything else. You just have a scene that really rocks right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because you're selling the book to the reader. I mean, open the book, let's get some movement, let's not have a lot of background, let's not have a lot of description, let's not have a lot of context. So that's the way that it should go. That's not the way that I'm inclined to write.
Mm-hmm.
I'm inclined to, you know, this was a dark and stormy night, and you know, Frank Burns was standing outside smoking a cigarette. I don't want to do that. I want to have, you know,
Bang.
I want it,
Yeah.
I want it to start.
Right.
I want the story to start. Then I'll come back and fix the rest of it. So at any rate, that's the way I do that part of it, and I never have really I have never really gotten to the point where I don't have those problems. I have to fight them every time. And as Chuck said at one point, at some point along the line, you're going to have 150,000 words in your head, and that's true with me. At some point, you've got the whole novel in your head, and I have never found that that it gets easier.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I come up to the end of the novel, I feel like my brain is bleeding because it's just all sitting there, and I'm dredging through it, looking for very fine mistakes, for little problems.
People don't understand how hard it
transitions and
is.
stuff.
It's hard work. I mean,
It's very hard work.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of start, we have to pay kind of homage to the way the culture is developed. 100 years ago, people read novels, and there were travel log vacations as ways to experience different things. Now you're inundated with so many things, and so there's always the question of hook, you know, getting attention. You can't take the chance on losing somebody's interest by indulging yourself in something, you know. And so there are pressures along those lines. You know?
And then there are technical items that you wind up doing because you're reading through the book and you realize I'm going to need a transition here, and a transition is just a technical thing, but it's got to be smooth and it's got to be effective and it's got to work, and it can't be too much of a cliche. You can't say, I mean, the classic transition is meanwhile back at the ranch.
Right.
Okay. Well, you sort of do that in some cases. Meanwhile back at the ranch. While Jim was doing that, Lucas was doing this. You can have those kinds of things, but when you go through a book sometimes in that last 6-week crunch period, you found out you've written a book that doesn't have any transitions. It's just a whole set of scenes. So then you go through and it's boring, but you've got to do it. You've got to write interesting, successive transitions that lead people from one scene into the next, and don't really have anything to do with action or movement or anything other than just getting people from one place to another. And you have to do those kinds of things if you want the book to be successful. When a reader is reading a book, they read it in a matter of hours. When you're writing it, you write it in a matter of months or a year or so. And so what happens is that sometimes you can have some details up in the front part of the book that don't match the back part of the book. Well, they've got to, because the readers will see them, because they're too close together for the readers. So that among all the other things you have to do is that you have to reconcile even the tiniest details have to be reconciled. I found that one trick that I use, I don't think that I look like Lucas Davenport, and I don't try to portray myself as ever having looked like him, but he has blue eyes like I do. He's about my height. He's about my weight, even though I'm a little bit overweight. And he's not. You know, he's got more muscle than I do. The point is that I do that not because I want him to look like me or because I imagine that I'm him, but because it eliminates details that I have to remember.
You can kind of get into the rhythm a little bit.
And so I have a feeling that Broker looks like Chuck, and the reason why not looks like him, but has a lot of outside details is because it's one way that you can deal with that kind of stuff without having necessarily to have it written down or have it by rote memory.
We're kind of winding down to the end, but I wanted to ask you each a question, if you could answer briefly. If you weren't doing this, if you weren't writing, what would you be doing?
Well,
Landscaping, maybe.
when I was young, my mother sort of sent me this double message. She always wanted me to be an artist, but she sent me to military school. You know, and so it was always through my life one of the big tensions in my life. I probably, you know, when I was young, I thought that I would wind up being a cop or in the military. Fortunately, I turned into a drunk, and so I found my way to Minnesota to treatment and didn't have to worry and stay in.
Well, I'm glad that. It sounds like a whole other story we could get into. John, how about you?
I might be an academic of some kind.
An academic of some kind? Probably on an archaeological dig, which I apologize we didn't get a chance to get into too much. I think that's a fascinating subject. But I'd like to thank you both very much for being here today, Chuck Logan and John Kemp, my guests on the second part of a conversation with them for Northern Lights. And I'd also like to thank the folks at Once Upon a Crime for letting us take over the store for the filming of this two-part episode. Appreciate it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.